We're really glad you're here today. Today we're going to be talking about staying encouraged. I think moms need it. I think we all need it. I don't think anyone is immune to the fact that we live in a world that can beat us down and discourage us. So today we're going to talk about staying encouraged. And even more importantly, we're going to talk about how to be an encouraging person to other people, because I think this world really needs it. And one thing I remember years ago, as we were raising our children, and Greg and I have five children, and this was, right now the oldest is 22 and the youngest is 13, and within the 9 years span we have 5. But this was when they were all under 10. There were years it was cray in our home, okay, for many, many years. It was really, really crazy. And we were in the process of moving from LA to Nashville. And we had this great thought, what an incredible experience it would be to drive across the country. Now, in LA, in our home, that sounded like a great idea. But being a month displaced from your home, living out of a minivan in a hotel room for a month with 5 children, and not to forget the pet bunny, it became kind of discouraging and overwhelming. And I remember it was in the middle of winter, and it was cold, and we arrived in Nashville. Our home wasn't ready, and this was about day 30 of our month on the road. And this bunny was just bouncing around in our hotel room, and the kids were running, and we said, let's get out. But it was snowing outside. It was cold. It was January. So we're like, okay, where can we go? Let's go get dinner somewhere. So we decided to go to one of our favorite restaurants. Kind of not a great idea if you have 5 little children to go to a nice restaurant in the middle of winter after you've been on the road for a month. And I just remember going into this restaurant, and our boys were expending about a whole month's worth of energy in this 1-hour restaurant break. They were bouncing, jumping in the booth, like jumping, grabbing Dad, hanging on his neck. Becca, our oldest, was, just coloring her page. She was so good. She was just sitting there coloring, trying to not make it. And then our youngest had a stinky diaper, like a really stinky diaper, not one that you could just kind of wait until the end of the restaurant break and deal with. It was toxic. Heads were turning. We were that family. I have such compassion for you families as you go to restaurants today. Have mercy on those young moms. They're trying. One year, after about 3 restaurants of trying on Mother's Day, we did a drive-through and ate in the car. I mean, this is what we were dealing with. And they were bouncing up and down in the booth. And then Jessica had the stinky diaper, and I had to go out to the car in the snowy parking lot and try and find a diaper in the midst of everything we owned, and the fast food trash and the crayons and the Cheerios that had kind of been thrown around our car for a month. And Greg hands me the keys, and he says, if you don't come back, I understand. And that just kind of encapsulated the whole month of how we felt. And I went out to the car, and I was just thinking in my head, the voices were telling me to give up and to just go back home to what was familiar, warm weather and sunny skies and, a nice home and a comfortable life. And the voices inside me that were telling me to quit were louder than the voices that were telling me to keep going and that I could do it and that I was going to make it. And I think that we can all identify with that. Whether you've been in a snowy parking lot with a stinky diapered kid and 3 others wreaking havoc in the restaurant, you can identify with the voices of discouragement. It starts out really early in life. You send your child to school, and they don't get picked for the team, or they get picked last, and they feel like they're not good enough. Or they don't get into advanced math, and all their friends got into advanced math, and so they're not feeling smart. And as a mom, I feel this a lot, the pressure. I remember one year we had to do a diorama for school, and I didn't remember what dioramas were. And I did my best to kind of research diorama, and we went and we bought the supplies, and we worked really hard on this diorama. And then the teacher talked to us afterwards and said, these are the expectations of the diorama, and look at what all the other kids did. Can you kind of go back and redo your diorama? And I was like, oh my gosh. And then there was the time I brought Costco pizzas for baseball practice. And you buy pizza for the whole team, and everybody's like, yeah, until next week when the mom made homemade bentos with perfectly cut sandwiches. She must have been a Pinterest mom. I mean, die-cut name tags with little gifts and decorated cookies. And I'm like, who does this? Or just last week, I was watching Pioneer Woman, and Pioneer Woman on Food Network was making homemade potato chips. And my kids were like, oh, that looks so good. Can we do that? And inside the voice is like, bad mom, go heat up yourself something in the microwave. It's yo-yo night. I'm not cooking. Or I also got a thank you card from my nephew this last week. And his handwriting looks like a computer font. And my kids were sending out thank you notes to the same people that same week, and I put them side by side, and I said, oh no. And Greg said, your kids are good at other things. He was encouraging me. But it doesn't take long for us to realize that this world can be a very negative, discouraging place. But we serve an encouraging God. We serve a God that is an encouraging God. It is who he is. And there's situations I realize that are more serious, that weigh heavier on us. There's you've been looking for a job and you can't even get an interview. Or maybe you're working 2 jobs and you're still not making ends meet. Or maybe there's a wayward child that you're just wanting a relationship with again and it's just not working out. So I realize those are funny examples, but there are serious ones. There are serious ways and valid reasons that we can be discouraged, that just life can weigh us down. The good news is that we serve a God who is encouraging. It's his nature. He is an encouraging God. We're going to look today in John 14, and we're going to see that one of the most spiritual things we can do as Christ followers is to learn to be an encouragement, to encourage other people. In a world that constantly is tearing people down, we can build people up. We can speak life into them. And when we do, we really speak the Spirit of God into them. We can encourage them. In John 14, Scripture says, and I will ask the Father, and he will give you another advocate to help you and to be with you forever, the Spirit of truth. Now that word advocate, it means paraklesis, meaning one who is called alongside to help. So you have an advocate, the Holy Spirit, God living inside of you, who's called alongside to help. He fights for you. He's your helper. He's someone who is comes alongside to help you, to support you. He's always there for you. He's a counselor. He's a comforter. Someone who's called alongside to comfort you when you're discouraged, to lift you up and speak life, to exhort you, to encourage you, to tell you don't give up. He's the encourager, the one who's called alongside to lift you up when you're down. That is the nature and spirit of God. He is an encouraging God. So if we're to reflect the nature and character of God, we should be encouragers because God is an encouraging God. There's a book, I don't know some of you may have read it. There's a children's version too, but it's called, I think the title is something like How Full Is Your Bucket? And the principle of this book, and I've only read the children's version, so I don't know the adult version. It might be a different title, but the premise of the book is that there are 2 types of people. There are bucket fillers and there are bucket drainers. And whenever you encourage someone or you speak words of hope or life into someone, you're filling their bucket. But when you are speaking words of criticalness and cynicism, discouragement, you're draining their bucket. So the premise is that we should be bucket fillers, that when we fill our buckets ourselves are filled. When you encourage someone, there's a drop that goes in your bucket as well. So you get a double benefit from filling buckets. So today we're going to look in the book of Acts at a bucket filler. His name was Barnabas. And in Acts 4, we can see how this attitude affected the people around him. His attitude lifted people up and caused them to look at what God wanted to do in their lives and believe that they could do it. And we're going to see in Acts 4, his name was Joseph. So his actual name, his birth name was Joseph. He was a Levite from Cyprus, whom the apostles called Barnabas, which means son of encouragement. Sold a field he owned and brought the money and put it at the apostles' feet. So his name was Joseph, but somewhere along the way, the apostles had given him this nickname, meaning son of encouragement. So think of this. What would you have to do in your workplace, in your friendship group, in your school, to get the name son of encouragement? You'd have to be a pretty good bucket filler. You would have to be a pretty good person that would speak life and encouragement and inspiration to other people. So that's the nickname that Barnabas was given from his friends. He was called son of encouragement. And that word used for encourage is the same word we just looked at, parakletos. It means to come alongside, to help, to encourage, to exhort, to comfort. So let's see this at work in the life of Barnabas, because he must have been doing something that was speaking life and inspiring the people around him. So in the book of Acts, a few chapters further in, we see this man named Saul. Now Saul had a reputation for persecuting Christians. He would beat them. He was trying to destroy the church. But then in Acts 9, we see this radical thing happen, and that Saul gets saved. Jesus appears to him. He gives his life to Jesus and gets on this mission to build the church instead of tear it down. So he has this radical conversion, so radical that his name goes from being referred to as Saul to being Paul. But here's the problem. Because he had this reputation of beating Christians, do you think the Christians welcomed him? No, not really. They were afraid of him. And in Acts 9, we see that Saul grew more and more powerful, baffling the Jews living in Damascus, proving that Jesus is the Messiah. But then you can only imagine that they're not going to really receive him very warmly. And so in Acts 9, it continues, and it says, when Saul came to Jerusalem, he tried to join the disciples, but they were all afraid of him, not believing that he really was a disciple. Understandably, I mean, he'd been beating them, he'd been dragging them, he was trying to destroy their work, and now all of a sudden he kind of has a change of heart and is trying to tell them, no, wait, I'm one of you now. And they're like, I don't know about you, Paul. So they were keeping their distance. But Barnabas, and I love in the scriptures when it has all of these negatives and then it goes, but Barnabas. So, but Barnabas took him and brought him to the apostles. He told them how Saul on his journey had seen the Lord and that the Lord had spoken to him, and how in Damascus he had preached fearlessly in the name of Jesus. So Saul stayed with them and moved about freely in Jerusalem, speaking boldly in the name of the Lord. Because Barnabas advocated for Paul and came alongside him, the apostles accepted him. The disciples accepted Paul. They accepted his ministry. Because Barnabas spoke well of Paul, Paul's ministry began to gain support and momentum. God began to move through Paul's life in a way that he might not have otherwise been able to move had he been kept alienated from the other disciples. Because of Barnabas, Paul had the courage and the affirmation to believe that God really could use a guy like him. That it didn't matter all of the things that he had done in the past, but that God really could use him. That God really did have a plan for him, and that God really did call him to preach God's word. But what would the church have been like if Barnabas hadn't been there? If Barnabas just kind of said, yeah, you know what, you kind of messed up, Paul. The disciples were like, not sure about you. What would the church have been like? Paul went on to write a lot of the New Testament. He went on to plant many churches throughout Asia. But it was one man that came alongside, spoke words of life, words of hope, words of encouragement, words of inspiration that made Paul think, I can do this. I'm going to fulfill the call of God on my life because of that one man who came and believed in him and made other people see that Paul really was a different person, and that he didn't have to be judged by his past, but that he could be judged by what God had done in his life. So about 20 years later, we see Paul, and he's writing to this church in Corinth. Now, this is a church that he'd had a difficult relationship with this church in Corinth. He'd had to address some difficult issues. He'd had to come down hard on them in some situations and tell them they were, off track in these certain situations. But here we see the heart of Paul, and I think this is the emphasis and the impact that Barnabas had on his life. In 2 Corinthians even starts in chapter 1, and we don't have it in your notes, but he says, "Blessed be the God of all hope and the God of all comfort and encouragement." So he's saying to these people that he'd had to address and tell them some difficult things. He's saying God is an encouraging God. Don't let the past that I've had to confront you, we've had to deal with some issues, but don't let that hinder you, because God is the God of all comfort and the God of all encouragement. And then he repeats himself again in chapter 7, and that's what we're going to look at today. He said, when we arrived in Macedonia, there was no rest for us. We faced conflict in every direction, with battles on the outside and fear on the inside. But God, who encourages those who are discouraged, encouraged us by the arrival of Titus. So Paul says, when we arrived in Macedonia, there was no rest for us. Now, some of you may feel that. You may feel battles going on everywhere. There's no rest for you. Young moms with newborns, you know there is no rest for you. You'll get some in about 8 years, unless you have another child, and then you can delay that another few years after that. There's no rest. There's no rest for you. Maybe students, you just finished finals, and you were pulling all-nighters, and you were studying for those finals. There was no rest for you. God understands. Paul is saying, when we arrived in Macedonia, there was no rest for us. He identifies with their problem. And he said, we faced conflict in every direction. Everywhere we looked, there was conflict. Everywhere. With battles on the outside and fears on the inside. Paul identifies with them. And many of you right now, you can identify too. You've got battles on the outside. You've got fears on the inside. Maybe your life was going in a certain direction, then you're like, whoops, didn't see that coming. Didn't expect that. Or I'm afraid of what's going to happen. There's family tension, health issues, future unknown. There's battles on the outside. There's fears on the inside. But then Paul does this thing again. But God. He has all these negative things. We've got battles on the outside. We've got fears on the inside. But God. But God. And he says, God who encourages those who are discouraged, encouraged us by the arrival of Titus. So God encouraged Paul by sending this guy named Titus. And I think it's little things like that that can really encourage people on a daily basis. Just this guy coming and saying, hey, I'm just here to support you. Or, hey, can I pray for you? Or, hey, you did a great job. It's little things that God did to encourage him. So if you walked into church this morning and you're feeling heavy and discouraged, you've got battles on the outside, fears on the inside, but God. We have a God that encourages those who are discouraged. He will encourage those who are discouraged. So in Paul's case, he did something really small. He sent a friend. Sometimes it's big things, sometimes it's small things. Just sending a friend, sending someone to be with you through whatever you're going through. So let's look at today how we can be those encouragers to other people. Because in a world that's constantly tearing people down, you go to your workplace on Monday morning, you go to your campus, there's not going to be a lot of people that are looking, they're not going, oh, how can I encourage people today? People in the workplace, in your neighborhood, in your community, they're not looking, most people are not looking to be bucket fillers. They're not looking naturally to encourage other people. They're just trying to get through their day. They're trying to get their work done. They're trying to take care of their family. But we can be those bucket fillers. We can look out of our own situations to be an encouragement to other people. So we're going to look at how to be a voice of encouragement in a world that's surrounded with discouragement today. The first one is this: encourage others daily. Why? Because the voices of discouragement are real and they're constant. You do someone and says, oh, that wasn't very good. Or you're working on a project and you can't figure it out, and the internal voice in your mind says, I'll never be able to figure this out. You're not a good provider. You're not a good mom. Don't make homemade potato chips from scratch. You'll never get to that level in your company, or you'll never graduate from school. You'll never pass that class. The voices are so constant. That's why the writer in Hebrews said this in Hebrews 3. He said, but encourage one another daily. Daily. Encourage one another daily, as long as it is called today, so that none of you will be hardened by sin's deceitfulness. So we encourage one another every day. Every day we look for ways to encourage other people. Why? Because the world has a way of hardening us. The world has a way of discouraging us and weighing on us. And when we encourage others, it's a way of lifting those burdens off of their shoulders. It's a way of us being used by God in a world to show them how much God cares. So here's a good rule for us. Let's practice this week. If you think of something good, say it. Don't go, oh, I don't want to puff them up and they'll be arrogant, or if I encourage them, then there's less for me. If you think of something good, say it. Let's do that. Write that down. If you think of something good, say it. If you think of something good, text it. Some of us, I think of it a lot during the day. Oh, I should encourage that person. I should let them know I'm praying for them, or I should let them know that I'm here for them if they need to talk. But I don't take that next step and actually do it. Let's do it. If we think of something good, let's say it to one another. Let's be bucket fillers. Think of what our community would be like if all 350 of us were to go out this week and determine to fill people's buckets on a daily basis. Think of how the culture would change if the church took the responsibility to be encouragers. If you work in retail, to just be that encourager when you're helping people, just to be that encourager. If you're in the restaurant industry, to be that hostess, that server that's encouraging and inspiring people. If you're in the workplace and you see someone weighed down in their cubicle, to be that one that comes alongside to help them and lift their burden. If you're in school and you see somebody struggling with their homework, to help them. To help them. Let's be encouragers daily. And I'm not immune to needing encouragement either. I mean, there's one woman in this church who encourages me every Sunday, and I go looking for her. She is the first person I look for when I get here at 6:30 in the morning. I go looking for her. I'm like, where is she? She's going to fill my bucket. I need to be around her because she is so oozing with encouragement. You can do it. Let me pray for you. You are great. There's a senior in our church for 8 years. Every week has been encouraging Greg every week. He's like, you are the man for this church. You are God's chosen person for this hour in this church. You have been called for this. Every week, filling his bucket. He's not saying, oh, you know what, the music's too loud, or I've got this and this. He's like, I'm going to fill his bucket. You are called for this. We can do that. That's easy for us. You don't have to know a lot of scriptures to do that. You don't have to know any scriptures. You just have to say, you can do it. I'm here for you. You can fill somebody's bucket. So if you think of something good, say it. If you think of something good, text it. Encourage people. And that's why Sunday services and small groups, grace groups, are so important. Because it's an environment where we come together and we encourage one another. We fill each other up and we give each other the wind in our sails to be able to go out into a world that's not very encouraging on a daily basis, to where we get fuel in our tanks to be able to go and be that to other people. In Hebrews 10, the writer continues on and he says, let us hold tightly without wavering this hope we affirm. For God can be trusted to keep his promise. Let us think of ways to motivate one another to acts of love and good works. Think of what this world would be like if people sat around and thought of ways to motivate one another. Think of what your workplace would be like if you had a think tank on how to motivate one another and how to encourage one another, how to inspire one another. Think of what it would be like to acts of love and good works. Let us not neglect our meeting together as some people do, but encourage one another, especially now that the day of his return is drawing near. Let us think of ways to motivate one another, to encourage one another. Let's not neglect meeting together as some people do. The importance of us coming together, coming into Grace Group once a week and praying with one another and saying, you know what, this is not going well and I need prayer. And speaking life to those people, speaking encouragement, speaking hope. And then when you need it, they're speaking it into you. It's a mutual encouragement, a mutual building each other up. So let's encourage each other daily. The second thing we can do is encourage others spiritually. Encourage others spiritually. Let's choose to be a spiritual encouragement to people. Someone puts together a good project at work, and you can say, hey, you did a great job on that project. Someone does a redo on their house, man, you chose a good color of paint. But let's take just that normal encouragement and let's add a spiritual element to it. What would that look like? Okay, so if you're at work and somebody gets a job promotion, you can go, man, great job, congratulations. Good job on that job promotion. But then you take it to a spiritual level and you say, you know what, you've been so faithful. God is entrusting you with more now because you've been so faithful in those small things. Or your kid is playing soccer and he scores a goal. You could go, way to go, son, I'm so proud of you. Or you can also add a spiritual dimension to it and say, man, God has given you gifts, and that is so great to see you use the gifts that he's given you to be a part of a team. We can take just a normal everyday encouragement, but we can add a God element to it. And then they know, wow, you can text someone, man, I'm thinking of you. But then you can say, I'm going to pray for you today. So they know there's a God that cares about me. There's someone that cares about me. There's a God that cares about me. There's a God that wants to encourage me. So it's not just from you, but they could see it as it really is, as encouragement from God. In Romans, Paul writes this way, and I believe some of this was just the time he spent with Barnabas. He learned this stuff from his time with Barnabas. Paul wrote, one of the things I always pray for you is the opportunity, God willing, to come at last and see you. And then he said, for I long to visit you, so I can bring you some spiritual gift that will help you grow strong in the Lord. So when we encourage people, we're helping them grow. We're helping them grow spiritually. If they're way down, we're telling them, you can do it. God will get you through this. You can do it. Don't give up. We can be a gift with our words, and we can encourage other people. So, and then the last thing, we encourage one another daily. So if you think of it, say it, text it, do it. Be that voice of encouragement. Encourage people spiritually. Think of ways that you can encourage them in their faith. Encourage them to know that God is faithful, that God is for them. And the second one, it might surprise you, but it's super important that we learn to do this. Encourage yourself in the Lord. And let's look at an example of this in the Old Testament. In 1 Samuel 30, we see a man named David. Now, David ended up becoming king of Israel, but at the time that we're reading this, he is in exile. In fact, he's running from his life. There is a king that is after him, trying to kill him, and he and all of his army are having to hide in caves. For about 15 years, he is on the run and in hiding. And one day when they're out fighting in this foreign land, they come home and everything had been taken. Everything. Everything they owned had been taken, but not only that, their wives had been taken and their kids had been kidnapped. So imagine how discouraged David would have been, because he's the leader. So not only did he lose his whole family, did he lose everything he owned. All 400 of his men lost everything they owned, lost their wives, and lost their kids, and now they wanted to kill him. So he was discouraged. And in 1 Samuel 30, we see that he had trouble on the outside, and he had fear on the inside. It says this in verse 6, David was greatly distressed because the men were talking about stoning him. Each one was bitter in spirit because of his sons and daughters. So people were talking about stoning him. You think you've had a bad day? Nobody's trying to stone you today. Everybody was mad at David. Everybody wanted to kill him. He had no safe place to go. So what does he do? David found strength in the Lord, his God. King James Version says, David encouraged himself in the Lord. Encouraged himself. He saw what fear on the outside, battles on the outside, fear inside of him. He had no safe place to go, so he found strength and encouragement in the presence of God. And I think that's a good lesson for us too. When the battles are on the outside and the fears are on the inside, we can run to God. We can run to Jesus. No matter who you are or where you are in your relationship with God, maybe you've run 1,000,000 miles in the other direction away from God, you can still come to God in your moment of distress. When there's battles on the outside, there's fear on the inside, you can come to Jesus. You can pray. You can say, God, I don't even know what to do. I don't know how I'm going to get through this, but I ask you to encourage me. I ask you to give me the strength. We come and we open the Word. We open His Bible and we just begin reading. The book of Psalms is a great place to start. It's a book of comfort. This is one of the reasons we encourage you to keep a journal. Greg said, be sure to say notebook because men won't journal. So men, it's a notebook. Women, it's a journal. But I write down things. I write down my prayer requests. I write down what I feel God's saying. And then I can look back and go, man, God, you're faithful. You are faithful. You answer prayer. You are a good God. You are a good God. You are a faithful God. We can encourage ourselves in the Lord. So when you feel the battle on the outside and the fear on the inside, you can go, my God's going to get me through this. My God is faithful. My God is faithful, and He's going to get me through this. He is faithful, and I know a year from now I'll look back and I'll be stronger because of it. I'll be closer to God because of it, and I'll be able to encourage someone going through the same thing because I worked this through in my life. So encourage ourselves in the Lord. And David ended up getting everything back. They returned it. They were able to somehow get all of their wives and kids back. And in the end, it worked out for him, and God returned it and was able to return everything. So maybe you walked in today with the voices of discouragement saying you're never going to make it, you're not going to get through it, don't even try, you're always going to struggle financially, there's not enough of you to go around, you're not a good mom, you're not a good wife, you're not a good husband, you're not a good boss, you can't do it, you don't have what it takes. God would say, but God, God who encourages those who are discouraged. He's the God of all comfort, the God of all encouragement. He comes alongside. He's the Parakletos. He comes alongside to help. He comes alongside to strengthen. He comes alongside to give us the grace and to comfort and to console us and to be our encourager, to speak life into us when we have the battles on the outside and the fears on the inside. So we encourage one another daily. When you see something, think of something, say it, text it, do it. Be a bucket filler in your community. Be a bucket filler in your workplace and in your family. Encourage one another daily because the world will harden people. But let's counter that with the life of God, with the encouragement of the Spirit of God that lives inside of us. Let's encourage others spiritually. Have you ever had somebody say when you run into them, oh, I was just thinking about you. That's so weird that I run into you today. Or you text someone and praying for you and like, oh, that's so odd that you would just text me at this moment because I was just going through this. When you encourage one another spiritually, you have the opportunity to point them to God as the source of their encouragement. Let's continue to do that. Let's be a voice of encouragement. And then when you feel the battle on the outside and the fear on the inside, encourage yourself. Get in the Word of God and let the Scriptures encourage you. Read Psalms, where David wrote many of the Psalms. And he is, during this time that he's hiding in caves and running for his life, he's pouring out his heart to God. And he is looking up and asking for God to encourage him. You can read those and know that you're not alone, and know that God is faithful, and know that God is good, and know that the spirit of encouragement, the same God that encouraged David and encouraged Paul, lives inside of you and will encourage you and lift you through this.